Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're here today to talk about the options for 2020 since the current ACO will end at the end of this year. And this is Catherine Hansen. I'm the head of strategy for QVH Systems, and I have with me Dr. Sexton. Dr. Sexton, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, greetings everyone. My name is Michael Sexton, and I'm the CEO and Chief Medical Officer of QVH Systems, which helps our ACO here in Ventura.
Okay, so we're going to go forward with the options for 2020. Essentially, there are 4 of them. So the first one is you could just go back to the pure MIPS system, which actually most of you have not been involved in. I know a couple of you were, but most of you have not been involved because the ACO started as the MIPS program started. You can join the new BCFMC ACO, which will be an advanced APM, and that means it will have downside risk, but also a potential 5% bonus every year. You can do nothing, or you could join a different advanced APM or other ACO. So let's move on to the next. Okay, so let's start with the first option, which is going back to pure MIPS. So just to remind you, if you were in the MIPS program, you must report on 6 measures for 60% of all of your patients, regardless of payer. Those of you in the ACO have been doing the web interface, which is only applicable to Medicare fee-for-service patients, but the web interface is not available to groups with less than 25 clinicians. So none of the groups currently in the ACO would be able to do the web interface. You must also do improvement activity. You would have to report either 40 points if you're a larger practice or 20 points for small practices. That's 15 or fewer. So you'd have to do that and report it. The next thing is promoting interoperability. That's the one thing you all have been doing. The program is different this year, as we've already discussed for everyone, because this year you have to report on every measure in the Promoting Interoperability program in order to avoid getting 0 points for that domain. And finally, at least 15% of your score, and that percentage is going to go up every year until it reaches 30, will be based on your cost efficiency. And unfortunately, none of you know what that is right now because they haven't tracked that for you since you've been in the ACO. Next slide. Okay, so if you do nothing in 2020 in the MIPS program, you get a 9% Medicare fee schedule reduction, which would be applied every year. So it is every year that you do nothing now in the future, MIPS will apply that 9% reduction. So you can calculate that by looking at how much money you're making from Medicare on the fee-for-service side for your professional services and multiply that times 9%, and that tells you what that number is. For those of you that have the minimum threshold that requires that you be in MIPS, that would be the $90,000 times 9% would be about $8,100 a year in reduction. If you try to do MIPS, then your score is what's going to determine what happens to you. If you are over the threshold, you will get a positive adjustment. Now again, the MIPS program has been getting harder every year, and one of the things that's happening is that the threshold is increasing till where it gets to the median or mean over the next few years. Probably in 2020, they're going to put the threshold at 45 points or somewhere around there. You should know at this point that the median or mean for the program is very, very high. Very, very high, certainly significantly higher than 45 points. If you score under the threshold, you will get a penalty. We've already talked about the maximum penalty of 9%, but if you're under the threshold, the penalty will be scaled from 9% up to 0 as you get closer to the threshold. What about if you score over the threshold? Well, you will get a positive adjustment, but the size of that adjustment is going to depend on how many doctors got penalties, and so how much money is actually in the penalty pool, because this is just a winners and losers program. If you score in the exceptional performance range, meaning that you're at least in the top 75% of those over the threshold, then you'll get a minimum of another 0.5% upward adjustment. And of course, I think everyone here knows that the ACO for last year, their MIPS score was 96.5%, which meant that you got almost the maximum adjustment, which was close to 2.5%. Next slide. Okay, if you want to return to pure MIPS, you should contact folks to help you now make an assessment of what that's going to require and what that will cost you. Many of your EHR vendors have a MIPS program that you can work with. Many of you in specialty societies may have a qualified clinical data registry that supports measures specific for your specialty, and they may be able to help you, or you can go to a straight MIPS qualified registry. We at QVH Systems do offer a MIPS qualified registry, and we're certainly happy to talk to you about that if you would like to go in the pure MIPS direction. Next slide. Okay, option two. Option two is to continue on with the ACO in its new iteration. So the government has completely changed the way that the MSSP program is working, and so based on a lot of evaluation, the board of the ACO decided that it made sense to go into this particular track, and I'm going to go through what the benefits of being in this track are. So the first is on MIPS. So again, this ACO will only be dealing with the web interface, so you don't have to worry about trying to track measures on your other patients who are in commercial products or other types of products. You're only going to be worried about patients who are in the fee-for-service Medicare program, and it will be basically the same measures that you've been working on, and then only for the sampled patients, the ones that Medicare picks. Improvement activity, you don't have to do anything there because by virtue of being in an APM, the government automatically gives you points for that. Promoting interoperability. If you are a qualified participant, and we'll talk about that in a minute, you would not even have to report promoting interoperability. And finally, cost, again, is not relevant to MSSP ACOs because the government believes that all the incentives in the ACO to earn shared savings are enough to keep you from overutilization. Okay, then what are the financial benefits? Well, again, if you are a qualified participant, you get a lump sum 5% bonus on all of your Part B professional services paid in January following each performance year. If you're not a qualified participant, you're still likely going to get a positive MIPS adjustment, just like you did this year from the ACO. Again, if you actually earn shared savings, you will get a share of those shared savings, and we think that the odds that the ACO earns shared savings are higher in this new program, both because you all have learned a lot over the last few years and are better at doing population health management, and also because there's some special programs in this ACO track that you can take advantage of that we believe will be helpful, including the 3-day SNF waiver, which is an opportunity to have patients be admitted directly to a SNF without having to spend the first 3 days in a hospital. And finally, this is an upside and downside program, but we believe the shared loss risk is minimized, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so what is a qualified participant? Well, to be a qualified participant, that means that you have to receive at least 50% of your Medicare fee-for-service revenue from Medicare beneficiaries who are attributed to an advanced APM. And that would be one like the VCFMC ACO that's being created that has at least 8% downside risk. Generally speaking, everybody who is a primary care provider is going to be a qualified participant because, for the most part, all of their Medicare fee-for-service beneficiaries are going to be assigned to the ACO, and we're evaluating this now, but most of the current primary care providers in the ACO are getting somewhere between 80 and 90% of all of their Medicare fee-for-service revenue from the ACO. So really no issue there. For specialists, it really depends on whether your referral base is in the ACO. If you are yourself an internal medicine subspecialist, for which you are actually serving as the PCP, then you will obviously be attributed most of those patients, or you'll get much of your money from those patients, as well as if there are other ACO participants who are referring to you. And finally, if you are a specialist who is not eligible for attribution, then you can actually aggregate the revenue you get from all of the advanced APMs in which you participate. And at this point, we have some specialists who are already at the 50% level, and we can certainly let you know where you are. Go ahead. Okay, so how do you determine your QP status? The first is you need to find out how much money you received from Medicare Part B payments in 2018. And we can tell you what Medicare says that was. At least we've got the estimates that Medicare gave us for everyone who's in the ACO. Then you need to figure out how much money you got in 2018 that was attributable to patients in the ACO. And we can tell you at least some relevant information. We can tell you everything that you earned from ACO attributed patients based on the CCLF, the claim feed that the government sends us every month. That's not a perfect number because there's some information that the government doesn't give us, like the information relevant to patients that were not attributed, the patients that opted out of data sharing, so we don't have that information because they wouldn't let us see it. And there's also some substance abuse and mental health information that the government has decided is too sensitive to be shared. So we don't have that as well. But certainly we can give you a good ballpark about what you got from ACO patients. We can also help you understand who was referring to you, what percentage of the total amount of money ACO patients got for services in your specialty were being provided by ACO doctors. So we have quite a bit of information if you're interested. In any event, once you find out those two numbers, you just divide them and figure out if you are getting 50% or a little more, at least a little more than 50% from the ACO. If you're getting more than 50%, then you will get the 5% lump sum bonus. If you don't, as we discussed before, you would get the regular MIPS adjustment just like you did for 2018. Feel free to email me if you would like information specific to your practice, and we're happy to either send it to you or set up a call to discuss it with you. And I will be out there this week, Wednesday and Thursday, to meet with people to the extent that you want to have an in-person discussion. Next slide. Okay, so let's say you find out that you're not currently receiving 50%, more than 50% of your fee-for-service revenue from ACO-assigned beneficiaries. There are several steps you can take. The first is that you can encourage the primary care physicians who are referring to you now to join the ACO. Obviously, the larger your referral base that's in the ACO, the more likely you're going to exceed that 50% threshold. You can also encourage existing ACO participants to refer to you more often. So if you're getting some referrals from some of the primary care physicians in the ACO, you could certainly reach out to them and find out if there's a possibility that they could increase their referrals to you. And finally, as mentioned, if you are a specialist who is not eligible for attribution, so that means somebody who is not a traditional primary care doctor or an internal medicine subspecialty, then if there are other advanced alternative payment models in the Ventura region, you could join those and you can aggregate the money that you're receiving for patients in all of those. And as mentioned, if you're not going to get the 5% bonus, then you would get whatever the MIPS score had you do. And again, that would be the same as what's happening now. So for the most part, for those of you that would be in this position, you're not going to have to do much, if anything, on quality, because that's going to be handled primarily by the primary care providers in the APM. And you don't have to worry at all about improvement activity or your cost efficiency, because they don't count in MIPS. And the only thing that you will have to do is what you've already been doing, which is filing your promoting interoperability performance. Next slide. Okay, now finally, as mentioned, because this is an advanced APM, that means that it does have downside risk. But there are a number of things that the government does to reduce that risk. The first is that the risk is capped at 8%. So it's nothing like a traditional HMO where basically you are just completely at risk for whatever happens. Moreover, in the experience of the ACO to date, you have always generated savings. So the ACO has not been close to having any kind of downside, any kind of loss at this point. There is one caveat to that, which is that the government will rebase your benchmark for 2020, and that will include a 15% regional factor. And in the case of the VCFMC ACO, that will likely reduce your benchmark by a couple $100 or so, because the regional benchmark is lower than what has been the experience in the ACO. But it's still, even when we factor that in, the ACO hasn't been close to losing money. Another protection is that you only pay if the loss you have, if you do have a loss, you only pay if it exceeds the threshold that the board has set, and the board is currently debating what threshold they're going to set, but it will likely be at least 2%. So you would have to lose more than 2% of the total ACO budget, so several $1 million. And finally, Medicare only requires that you put a guarantee up for 2% of that amount. So 2% of the ACO's budget, not 8%. And for many reasons, that will likely be the cap of liability that you would ever face. And generally speaking, that will not increase over the 5-year period. Unless there's, some really big changes in the makeup of the ACO beneficiaries. So you would just put up that 2% one time. And there's also, just the facts that you know more now, and you have some additional tools that are available to you in an advanced APM, including the 3-day SNF waiver that I mentioned. And of course, there's the fact that as long as you're a qualified participant, you're going to have an 8% downside ultimate risk, but you get an automatic 5% lump sum payment each year. And again, that would make it look like your risk would only be 3%. For many of you, that is all your risk would be, because basically the only money that you will have to pay downside on will be for professional services, which is the same thing that is the basis of the 5% bonus. But for those of you who receive Medicare Part B money for other things like drugs or DME, then the 5% is only paid on professional services, whereas the downside is based on all Part B services. Actually, all Part B and Part A, but you don't have Part A, so you don't have to worry. Next slide. Okay, so what do you have to do if you want to join the ACO? Well, this will now be a 5-year agreement, and it's basically very much the same as what you were doing. So you have to agree that you will abide by the Medicare Shared Savings Program and the ACO rules. Just like now, you can stop voluntarily at the end of each year by providing timely notification to the ACO by the fall deadline. Unfortunately, that is an absolutely firm deadline, so if you miss it, you're in for another year, no matter what. But you can, if you decide that you don't want to be in anymore for one reason or another, you can get out. You will be dropped automatically if you haven't made any required financial contribution. And that includes the ongoing VCMA dues obligation. You can be dropped if you fail to comply with any of the board policies. And the final point here is that you're not going to get the money back that you put up, that 2%, until the ACO completes its 5-year term and the board has finished a full reconciliation of all financial issues. Basically, the money that's in the escrow account, if it's never used during the 5-year period, it will be returned to those who contributed it. But that cannot happen until the board has finally reconciled all of the books at the end of the contract term. Next slide. Okay, again, so requirements, you need to remain a Ventura County Medical Association member. You have to understand and commit to all the obligations of the ACO. That is going to include an upfront payment of 3% of your Medicare revenue as CMS determines it to be. So, as I mentioned earlier, we do have CMS's initial estimate of what that number is, but that we'll get a final number from CMS, and that's the amount that you will have to put up. That 3% is being used first to cover the escrow commitment, which is 2%, and then the first year of operations, and that is because the ACO initially had some reserve funds that the board was very gracious to donate to the startup of the ACO, but at this point there is no more money in the reserve fund, and so the ACO has to be operated. If the ACO is successful in earning shared savings, then that may eliminate any future obligation to pay for operations. And similarly, the ACO is currently looking into some other alternatives to get operating funds. To the extent that it gets operating funds from other sources, then there will be less obligation for you to put any money up for that purpose. You also have to agree to maximize annual wellness visits. It's very clear that the reason the ACO did so well on its MIP score this year was because of the dramatic increase in the quality scores, and that was largely driven by a significant increase in annual wellness visits. For those of you who are internal medicine subspecialists, the board is going to be much more serious about finding ways to make sure that all your beneficiaries have annual wellness visits, either because you hire an NP or PA to provide those, or because you coordinate with one of the PCP's practices in the ACO to make sure that your patients get those visits, because they're absolutely critical. Similarly, everybody must commit to maximizing quality scores. That is critical for the MIP score, and it's also critical for the percentage of shared savings that you get if you have shared savings. That includes patient satisfaction, so there'll be some more instruction for you on where the ACO is having some challenges and things you can do to improve those scores. To the extent that you are sampled for the web interface, you must be actively involved in making sure that the ACO gets the information it needs, and if you can't do that, then you are going to have to fund the ACO's consultant that does that work. Again, we are doing our best to minimize any obligation for web interface sampling by getting direct access to the information through either an API or a CCDA extract, and we will continue to do that, and you need to support that process as well. There is a health information exchange that has approached Mary Carr about operating in Ventura County. Should that happen, then you would have to join that. It would not cost you any money to participate, but you would have to, again, make your EHR information accessible to the Health Information Exchange. And finally, as now, you must agree to attend ACO educational programs, implement the ACO policies and practices, and use best efforts to provide efficient care. Obviously, with the potential for any downside risk, these things become even more important, and so there will be a focus on practice-specific evaluation and discussions about the things that you're doing well and the things that perhaps you're not doing so well. Next slide. Okay, another requirement is you have to complete the ACO participation agreement by the deadline. Just as before, that means it has to be fully executed. You need to provide a copy of your W-9 for your tax ID. You need a PACO screenshot that validates your current Medicare enrollment. You need to complete Schedule A, which covers all the physicians and non-physicians that are billing under your TIN, and you need to get attestation forms executed by each of those clinicians. And again, just as before, if it doesn't perfectly match the government system, they won't let you in. So even if there's mistakes in PACOs, it doesn't matter. You need to just make sure that what you've got on the form is exactly what it says in the PACO system. Okay, the best time to get your paperwork in is this coming Wednesday. We realize that's very short. There will be additional opportunity to continue to submit information into August and potentially early September. And as mentioned earlier, and as was the case before, you will be able to drop out if you decide that you the more you've thought about it, you don't want to do it, or you've decided you don't want to put up the escrow payment or whatever. But it's the same as before. You can drop, but if you don't get your paperwork in timely, then there's nothing that can be done. There's nothing we can do if you don't have the paperwork in. So please, if you think you're going to do this or you want to at least keep this option open, please get the paperwork done quickly. Mary is going to make the paperwork available to those who request it starting on Tuesday, July 23rd. So you can just send her an email and let her know you would like that information. The reason that it's optimal to get your paperwork in by July 24 is because that gives you opportunity to correct any mistakes. Basically, when you submit information in and we turn around and send it to the government sends us a response that tells us every problem that there is in any of the paperwork. And then you still have an opportunity to correct that. But if you wait until late August, then there's no opportunity. So if the material you put in is not correct, then you will not be able to be in the ACO, at least for 2020. And there's Mary's fax number, and you're certainly welcome to get the information to her physical address as well. Next slide. Okay, so then there's option number 3, do nothing. Well, we've already talked about the fact that if you really do nothing, what's going to happen is you're going to get a 9% reduction in all your Medicare Part B revenue because of your MIPS score. So your MIPS score will be 0, and that carries a 9% penalty. But I think it's also important to understand that the entire Medicare program and indeed the entire healthcare delivery system in the United States is really moving away from fee-for-service and into population health. And if you thought that this was just an Obama thing, you can take a look at this statement from Alex Azar from the Trump administration, and you can see that if anything, the rhetoric is more is even more urgent than it has been. Next slide. Okay, and then option 4. Well, you could look for another advanced payment model or alternative payment model out there. We can tell you that there is one that we know is looking in California called Aledade. It is a national ACO management company, and it's looking for primary care providers with at least 250 Medicare fee-for-service patients. At this point, it's my understanding that they are not looking at creating a downside risk ACO with the 5% bonus, but we can't speak for them. I provided the email there. You can contact them. They do require an upfront fee and a monthly fee, so you can, get all the specifics from them. And there are also a couple of other advanced APM models for primary care physicians, primary care first, and seriously ill populations. I'll talk about those a little bit more. And then there may be others in the Ventura region. I don't know. I just don't know them, but they may be out there. Next slide. Okay, so primary care first, that is a program that's open to MDs, DOs, clinical nurse specialists, NPs, and PAs that are certified in internal, general, geriatric, family, or hospice and palliative medicine. They need to have a minimum of 125 attributed beneficiaries, and their primary care services have to account for at least 70% of their collective billing. You have to be experienced with value-based payment, which all of you are now. You have to use a 2015 certified EHR, which all of you do now. You would have to fill out a form and attest to certain advanced primary care delivery capabilities, and you'd have to meet the requirements of the primary care first participation agreement. Next slide. The seriously ill populations model is sort of a subset of that. It's really specific to practices that focus on end of life or very significantly patients with a lot of chronic conditions. In this model, you would actually the government would give you patients, and your job would be to reach out and make sure that their care is coordinated and they're stabilized. And if you have patients that you think should be in the program, you can see if CMS will authorize them to join up. You get paid per patient, and those payments are high. They reflect obviously the high cost and risk nature of those patients, and whatever the payment is, it gets increased or decreased based on quality, much like the MIP score. And finally, if you focus on hospice or palliative care, you can actually focus entirely on that in this program, either on your own or by partnering with the primary care first practice. Next slide. The last I checked, they still had not put out the request for proposal. Basically, this is a program where you submit your application and the government then decides which practices they're going to let in. At this point, at least, that request for applications has not been issued, but there is a listserv. So if you Google primary care first and get to the CMS website, when you get to the primary care first page, you'll see the option to subscribe to the PCF model options listserv. I would strongly urge you to do that so you can get that information if you have any interest in this model. Next slide. Okay, and with that, we'll take some questions. But Michael, did you want to add anything further at this point?
No, I think you've covered it quite well, and I would be happy to entertain questions along with you.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending, and please don't hesitate to contact Mary or email me if you would like the additional information that we can get you on your QP status. And please join us this week at our in-person meetings if you'd like to discuss any of these opportunities more. Thank you so much.